The sun was barely above the horizon, but the heat was already enveloping Miltown in a sweltering blanket. The town, wedged between the hills and the old railroad, woke slowly, like an old man after a heavy sleep. The main street with cracked asphalt stretched from the rusty water tower to an abandoned factory that had closed back in the 90s. The concrete jail building on the outskirts was the newest structure in town. It was only 25 years old. Jim Tucker parked his tattered pickup truck in the prison's service parking lot. A man with a heavy body and rough facial features. He'd been working as head of security since a knee injury had ended his short-lived career as a halfback on the local college soccer team. Jim pulled out his coffee thermos and limped toward the entrance. In his 50s, he'd pretty much resigned himself to the fact that he'd never leave Miltown. This was where he'd been born, and this was probably where he'd die like most of the locals. The thought made his mouth taste bitter, and not even the strong coffee he brewed himself from a special recipe, the only thing he had left from his ex-wife, who had left Miltown for Chicago almost 10 years ago. "Good morning, boss." He was greeted by the front desk clerk, a young guy with a slouching cap. "Hey, Danny," Jim said, holding out his pass. "What's new?" "All quiet." C-Block was noisy after lights out, but Rodriguez had figured it out. Jim nodded. His mornings always started the same way. A brief conversation with the duty officer, then a tour of the grounds, a check of the guard shift, and the invariable cup of coffee in a cramped office with blinds constantly clogged with dust. Today was visitation day, which meant double-checking all the posts and the inspection room. Jim knew every crack in the walls of this prison, every possible loophole for smuggling 23 years on the job, had taught him everything. "Meeting day?" he asked Bill, the fat man from Texas who was in charge of the visiting room. "Yes, boss, 34 visitors on the list today." Tucker looked up the names. All the same faces, wives, mothers, children, coming in once a week to talk through the glass to those behind bars. Among them was the name Carol Jenkins' visitation, was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Maggie's Diner was the only place in Miltown that served decent coffee and blueberry pancakes that didn't make your stomach hurt. The place itself, with its faded red booths and linoleum that remembered back to the Reagan presidency, hadn't changed in decades. For the locals, it was not just a place to eat, but a kind of information center. Carol Jenkins had been waitressing here for 8 years. A skinny blonde with tired eyes and a network of fine lines around her lips, she moved between tables with the mechanical dexterity of someone who had done the same job 1,000 times. Her uniform, a light blue dress and white apron, was always spotlessly clean. "Sam wants more coffee," Maggie, the heavy woman in her 60s who owned the place, said to her. "And don't forget you're leaving at 10 o'clock tonight." Carol nodded, filling a regular customer's cup with fresh coffee. Sam, the local mechanic with hands forever black with machine oil, didn't even look up from his paper. "Thanks, honey," he mumbled. "How's your Harry?" It was a question Carol heard every week before her visit to the prison. Nothing unusual for a small town where everyone knew each other's personal histories down to their favorite underwear color. "It's hanging in there," she answered briefly, avoiding any further conversation. Deep down, Carol knew that the town had not fully forgiven her for her choice of husband. Harry had always been a difficult man, irascible, with a hard temper inherited from his alcoholic father. But behind his rudeness was a man who had once been able to make her laugh, even when she was on the verge of tears. That's all changed now. "Hey, you got a minute?" came the voice of Donna, another waitress, plopping down on a stool at the bar during a short break. "Only if it's quick," Carol replied, sitting down next to her and gratefully accepting a cigarette. Donna was her only real friend, the one who didn't judge her for still holding on to her marriage to the man behind bars. "Going to see him again?" Donna asked, blowing smoke through her nostrils. "Would you stop it already? How many times can you torture yourself?" Carol took a deep drag, feeling the smoke fill her lungs. This wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. "I'm his wife, Donna. I can't just leave him." Donna snorted. "You know Marco's been asking about you, right? He's a nice guy, a technician at the cable company. He's got a steady job." Carol didn't say anything back, but something inside clenched painfully. Marco, she'd been thinking about him too much lately, about the way he smiled, the way he looked at her when he came to fix the TV in her and her son's apartment. "I have to go," she said, putting out her cigarette. "I've got 3 more tables waiting, and then I've got to run." As she worked, Carol thought about her upcoming visit. She used to look forward to these meetings, even through the glass, even under the supervision of security, as a breath of fresh air. Now each visit seemed like a heavy duty. Something had broken between them, and she didn't know if it could be repaired. And then there was Marco, his warm brown eyes and hands that knew how to fix more than just a broken TV. Cell number 218 in Cell Block C was Harry Jenkins's home for the 3rd year, 8 by 10 paces. He knew for sure, because he'd measured that space hundreds of times when he couldn't sleep at night. At the top of the bunk was his cellmate Leo, an elderly crook serving his 5th sentence for insurance scams. Harry sat on the edge of his bunk, fiddling with a tattered photograph. It showed Carol smiling, holding their son Tommy, then only 4 years old. The boy was so grown up now, and Harry barely recognized him during his rare visits. Visiting day. Harry looked forward to it with anticipation and anxiety at the same time. Something had changed in Carol over the past few months. He could feel it even through the glass, see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. Prison had taught him to notice such details. Here it was a matter of survival. Harry had once been the best mechanic around, with hands that could revive any engine. A drunken bar fight, one bad punch, and the man who insulted Carol hit his head on the edge of the bar. 5 years in prison. That's the price of 1 minute's loss of control. "Hey, Harry, ready to see your hottie?" Leo hung his graying head off the bunk. "Back off, Leo," Harry said angrily, putting the picture away. "I'd be worried if I were you," Leo continued, jumping off the bunk with surprising agility for his age. A young woman like that alone. "You know what they say, if you don't use it, you lose it." Harry clenched his fists but held back one more fight and he could be stripped of his visitation rights. He couldn't let that happen. "I told you to back off," he repeated quietly, gritting his teeth. Leo grinned, clearly pleased with the effect, and headed for the cell door, which the guard was already opening for the morning roll call. In the shower room, where Harry was carefully shaving before meeting his wife, he was approached by Ricky, a young Hispanic man with a scorpion tattooed on his neck. "Hey, Harry," he called softly, looking back at the guard who was too busy talking to a coworker. "Did you hear the news?" "What news?" Harry asked, still shaving. "Your wife. She was seen with some guy in the parking lot of a movie theater last week. My cousin works there," he told me. Harry's hand shook and the razor left a thin cut on his cheek. A drop of blood slowly crept down, mixing with the shaving foam. "Shut up, Ricky, if you don't want trouble," Harry warned, but inside it all went cold. That explained the changes he was noticing in Carol, her aloofness, the way she avoided looking him in the eye, all the little signs he was trying to ignore. Harry rinsed off the rest of the lather, scrutinizing his reflection in the steel mirror. Prison had aged him, turned his once attractive face into a mask of hard lines and a constantly wary look. What did Carol see in him now? A shadow of her former husband? Alex Kowalski checked his uniform in front of the mirror in the security locker room. 27 years old, an athletic build, and ambitions that seemed too big for Miltown made him a black sheep among the other guards. Most of them were local guys who saw the job as an easy way to get a steady paycheck and pension. Alex was different. The son of Polish immigrants, he'd grown up in a neighboring town and only moved to Miltown because of the prison job, which he saw as a stepping stone to something bigger, maybe the FBI or the U.S. Marshal's service. "You're on the visitation room today, Kowalski," Rodriguez informed him, tossing the shift schedule on the bench. "Enjoy the drama." Alex nodded. He didn't mind being on visitation room duty. It was a relatively quiet job, and he had the opportunity to observe people, a skill he believed would come in handy in the future. In his 3 months on the job, Alex already knew most of the regular visitors, including Carol Jenkins. He had noticed a change in her behavior in recent weeks. She used to arrive half an hour before her appointment time, always well-dressed, with an easy smile. Lately, she'd been arriving in fits and starts, often with red eyes and the nervous movements of someone who wants to finish an unpleasant duty as soon as possible. Jenkins is on the list today, Alex remarked, looking over the names of the visitors. Ah, our local hottie, Ben said, an older guard with a potbelly that overpowered his belt. Good woman. Too good for a jerk like Harry. Alex knew Harry Jenkins' story. It was part of the mandatory orientation that all new guards went through: felony murder, impeccable prison behavior, no gang ties, a low-risk inmate. But Alex also noticed something. The way Carol furtively checked her phone before each visit. The way she hurried to leave immediately afterward. And then there was that situation 2 weeks ago. Carol had dropped her purse and a receipt from the Blue Lagoon restaurant in the next town fell out of it. Too expensive for a waitress for one dinner. Such details were more than just curiosity to Alex. He truly believed that attention to detail was what distinguished a good officer from a mediocre one, and although Carol Jenkins's personal life was not within the scope of his duties, his intuition told him that something was going on there that could have repercussions within the prison walls. He knew how quickly rumors spread among the inmates. If Harry found out that his wife was seeing another man... Alex shuddered involuntarily, buckling his holster. In Miltown, secrets had a way of becoming public, and as Warden Tucker often said, in this town, even the walls have ears, and the fences have eyes. Carol's old sedan, bought before Harry's arrest, struggled up the hill to the prison parking lot. The engine coughed and twitched as if something was broken in it, just like their married life. Carol turned off the ignition and froze for a moment, clenching the steering wheel to her knuckles. Through the windshield, covered with a thin layer of road dust, the gray prison building looked even more sullen than usual. The clock in the dashboard read 15 to 11. In the past, she'd always arrived half an hour in advance, so that she had time to gather her thoughts, fix her makeup, and mentally prepare topics for conversation. Now every minute of waiting seemed unbearable. Carol took a mirror out of her purse and examined her face critically. The shadows under her eyes, that foundation couldn't disguise the fine lines at the corners of her lips. Hair she'd recently dyed to hide the first gray at 35, she looked 40. Marco said she was beautiful, that her eyes lit up when she smiled. Harry hadn't said those words to her in years, not even before prison. Thoughts of Marco brought on a new wave of guilt. Carol slammed the mirror sharply shut and tossed it back into her purse. Next to the purse was a quadruple-folded piece of paper, the note he'd left in her mailbox. We need to talk, no more secrets. Call me M. Her cell phone vibrated. A message from Donna. Good luck today. Remember, you don't have to torture yourself. There's always a choice. Carol didn't bother to reply a choice. What choice? To be the devoted wife of a condemned man? Or to be the one whispered about behind his back? They didn't forgive such things in Miltown. She got out of the car, adjusted her dress, and taking deep breaths, headed toward the checkpoint. She twirled her wedding ring with her thumb, a habit she'd picked up in recent months when the ring had begun to feel unbearably heavy. Jim Tucker watched through his office window as Carol Jenkins crossed the parking lot. Her gait betrayed her tension, her back too straight, her movements stiff. If it weren't for the prison's strict rules, he would have assumed she was carrying something forbidden, but that wasn't the case. Tucker knew women like Carol holding on until the last minute, and then breaking. He had statistics. Only a third of marriages survived the first 3 years of incarceration. Life went on outside the walls, and gradually the prisoners became pale memories rather than living husbands. His own wife had lasted 7 years. Only in his case it wasn't he who was incarcerated, it was she, trapped in a small-town routine while he went to prison every day. Tucker sighed and gathered the papers into a neat stack. Today was the day to fill out the use of force reports from yesterday's altercation in the mess hall. Paperwork he hated as much as the nightly calls from his mother reminding him that at his 50, it wasn't too late to remarry and have kids. Leaving the office, he nodded to the desk clerk. Davis, I'll be in the visiting room. I'll check on things. He himself didn't understand why he had decided to go there. Usually, he trusted his subordinates to do this chore. Maybe it was a premonition. Jim Tucker didn't believe in the supernatural, but 23 years in prison had taught him to trust his gut, and his gut told him something was wrong today. The search procedure was torture for Carol. Every question from the guards, Every look seemed penetrating, as if everyone knew about her secret. The young guard, Alex Kowalski, studied her face especially closely as she signed the visitor's log. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked, handing her a temporary pass. "Yes, of course," she answered a little too quickly. "Just didn't get much sleep." When Carol finally entered the visiting room, Harry was already waiting for her behind the glass. His eyes, dark and heavy-lidded, found hers immediately. He tensed instantly, noticing her condition, like a predator smelling the blood of a wounded animal. Carol lowered herself onto the hard plastic chair and picked up the telephone receiver. Harry did the same on the other side of the glass. "Hi," he said, and even in that simple word she could hear the wariness. "Hi," she replied, trying to smile. "How are you?" "I'm okay. Tommy's not with you today?" She shook her head. "He has a swimming competition. The coach said he has talent." Harry nodded. Their son talked less and less about his father, less and less often mentioned his name in conversation, another small crack in the foundation of their crumbling family. The conversation continued as usual, awkward pauses, trivial news, stories about neighbors Harry barely remembered, but inside Carol, the pressure was building. Every word, every forced laugh seemed fake. She wanted to scream, to confess, to run away. Instead, she talked about the new menu at the diner. Alex Kowalski stood against the wall, watching the customers' 6 booths separated by glass. 6 pairs of people connected only by telephone wires, families, mothers with children, wives, occasional friends. Standard procedure required the guards to make sure there was no physical contact or forbidden gestures, but in reality, they were witnessing the most intimate moments of other people's lives. He listened involuntarily to the Jenkinses' conversation. Something in their interaction caught his attention. The tension hanging between them, the unspoken words. "Will you take over for 5 minutes?" Rodriguez asked him. "Need to use the restroom." Alex nodded, not taking his eyes off Carol. When Rodriguez came out, he took a step closer to their stall, staying in Harry's blind spot, but being able to hear their conversation. "You're kind of weird today," Harry said, his voice getting harsher. "Just tired," Carol replied, crumpling her napkin in her hands. "It was crowded at work." "Don't lie to me," Harry said quietly. "I've been behind bars for 3 years, but I still know the difference between truth and lies." Carol was silent, looking away. "Who is he?" Harry asked, and she flinched as if struck by a blow. "What are you talking about?" "Don't make an idiot out of me." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Who's that guy you were seen with?" Jim Tucker entered the visiting room just as Carol's face turned white at her husband's words. He knew that look, the fear of a cornered man, and he also knew Harry Jenkins's face, twisted with rage. Tucker had seen enough family drama to know that something had gone wrong. He approached Kowalski, who was standing too close to the Jenkins's booth. "What's going on here?" he asked quietly. "A family quarrel, I think," Alex replied. "He knows something about her cheating." Tucker frowned. "Where did that information come from?" "There's a rumor going around, and I noticed something." "We don't care about their personal lives," Tucker cut him off, but he felt uneasy inside. He knew how quickly situations like this could get out of hand. Just watch them closely. A hurricane raged inside Harry. Every denial from Carol, every avoidant look only confirmed the validity of Ricky's words. His wife, the person he loved most in the world, had betrayed him. While he'd been counting the days until his release, imagining their reunion, she'd been with someone else. "It's Marco, isn't it?" he asked, grasping the name someone had mentioned in a conversation about cable TV. "The tech guy?" From the way Carol's eyes widened, he realized he'd hit the mark. "Harry, listen," she began in a shaky voice. "It's not what you think. We're just friends." A lie, so obvious she didn't even try to make it convincing. "How long has it been?" he asked, feeling each word cut his throat. Carol didn't answer, lowering her eyes. "I'm asking, how long have you been sleeping with him?" His last words came out louder than he intended. Several heads turned in their direction. Harry noticed the guards tense up. He didn't care. "Harry, please," Carol whispered, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't mean for this to happen. I've been alone for so long. Her words, which perhaps should have softened the blow, only increased his rage. Alone? What did she think he was? A ghost? He was sitting here because of her, defending her honor from the drunken jerk who'd insulted her at the bar. You're my wife, he said through clenched teeth. Or are you not? Carol looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw what he feared most: determination. I'm getting a divorce, Harry, she said quietly. I can't live like this anymore. You can't do this to me. Harry's voice sounded muffled, as if from a deep well. Not after everything we've been through? Carol clutched the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Harry, I tried. For 3 years I've tried to keep our family together, but I can't pretend anymore. Pretend, he repeated, and the word was filled with bitterness. So everything was a sham? Our marriage? Your visits? All those promises to wait for me? No, not all of it, she shook her head. But I've changed. You've changed what happened. I did it for you. His voice broke into a shout, and the guard at the door stepped forward. That guy insulted you, and I stood up for you. And this is how you repay me? Carol flinched at his words. I never asked you to kill a man. It was your choice, Harry. Your anger, your inability to control yourself. And because of it, our son is growing up without a father, and I'm stuck in a town where everyone looks at me as the wife of a murderer. Her words hit harder than any fist deep down. Harry knew she was right. His temper, his bloody temper had ruined their lives, but to admit it was to lose the last thing he had left: self-justification. And now you're sleeping with that cable guy, he said with contempt, hoping he'll be Tommy's new daddy? That you'll be a perfect little family and I'll rot here and fade from your memory? Carol stopped crying. There was steel in her eyes. Marco is a good man. He cares about us, and yes, maybe with him, Tommy will have a chance at a normal childhood. Something snapped inside Harry. The last rod holding his anger together cracked and crumbled. The image of his wife in the arms of another man, his son calling a stranger daddy, it was too much. You will not take my son away from me, he hissed. I won't let you destroy everything I have left. Carol shook her head. I've already filed the papers, Harry. In a month, it'll be official, and then Tommy and I will be out of Miltown. Alex Kowalski noticed the change in Harry Jenkins's expression. His features were frozen. His eyes focused on something only he could see. Alex had worked in the prison long enough to recognize the signs of an impending storm. Sir, he turned quietly to Tucker, maybe we should intervene. Tucker hesitated. The rules only allowed him to interrupt a visit if there were clear signs of a threat, and so far there were only words. Give them a minute, he replied. But be ready. Alex nodded and moved to get a better view of the Jenkins booth. His attention was drawn to Harry's odd hand movements. The prisoner was doing something under the table, hidden from the guard's view. Carol saw Harry's face change. She knew that look, the same one that preceded his outbursts of rage. Now, however, there was something new, a cold, calculating determination she'd never seen before. Harry, I don't want to fight. She tried to calm the situation. Let's just have a calm discussion. It's too late for discussion. He cut her off. You've made your choice. Now it's my turn. Something in his voice made Carol jump. It wasn't the usual threat thrown in a fit of anger. It was a promise. What do you mean? She asked, feeling her throat constrict. Harry leaned closer to the glass, his voice almost gentle. I love you, Carol. I always have. But I'd rather see you dead than with another man. Carol felt a chill run down her spine. She instinctively pulled away, but the telephone cord held her back. You can't intimidate me, Harry. Not this time. Harry smiled, but his eyes remained icy. It's not a threat, he said quietly. It's a goodbye. Rodriguez returned to the visiting room and approached Jim. Everything okay, boss? Just observing, Jim replied, not taking his eyes off the Jenkins's booth. Family problems. Rodriguez nodded understandingly. You want me to check them out? No, Kowalski can handle it, Tucker replied. Too much attention could only inflame the situation. Suddenly, Harry made a sudden movement. Carol saw something glint in his hand, a metal object that he'd somehow smuggled through security or gotten in prison. "Harry, what are you doing?" Her voice trembled. "Solving our problem," he answered calmly. "Once and for all." Carol wanted to scream, to call the guards, but fear paralyzed her. She saw Harry manipulating the telephone cord as if trying to do something about the connection. In a panic, she tried to get up, but caught her foot on a chair and fell. The telephone receiver slipped out of her hands, hitting the floor with a clatter. "Security!" she finally shouted, trying to crawl away from the glass. "Help!" Alex reacted instantly, rushing toward the stall. Tucker was right behind him. They saw Harry scrambling backward, hiding something in the sleeve of his robe. Carol was lying on the floor, pale with fear. "What's going on?" Tucker asked demandingly, helping Carol up. He threatened me," she replied in a shaky voice. "He's got some kind of weapon." Harry seemed surprised by her reaction. He raised his hands, showing his empty palms. "I didn't do anything, it fell on its own." Alex checked the separating glass. It was intact. The phone connection looked intact, too. "Mrs. Jenkins, are you all right?" Tucker asked, scrutinizing the woman. Carol nodded, though she was still shaking. "Yeah, I just want to get out of here. Please." "Carol, don't leave like that." Harry's voice sounded almost pleading. "We're not done talking." But Carol was already turning away, and Alex could see that she was in shock. "I'll walk you out, Mrs. Jenkins," he offered, supporting her under her elbow. "Finish your visit, Jenkins," Tucker ordered, and 2 guards stepped forward to lead Harry away. Carol was shaking as Alex led her out of the visiting room. Her leg, which she had caught on, hurt, and Harry's voice still echoed in her ears. "This is goodbye. Do you need medical attention?" Alex asked, noticing that she was limping. "No, thanks," she replied. "Just bruised my knee, I just want to get out of here." Alex nodded. "I understand, shall I walk you to your car?" Carol shook her head. "No, thanks, I'm fine, I just need to, breathe." "If you say so," Alex agreed, though he was concerned about the woman's condition. "But don't drive if you're upset." Carol nodded and headed for the exit. In the hallway, she turned around. "Do you think he really could?" She didn't finish the sentence. "We'll check him out," Alex assured her. "Don't worry." Tucker watched the guards take Harry back to his cell block. The expression on the prisoner's face was strange, not anger, not frustration, but a kind of detached calm. "Check him thoroughly," Tucker ordered, "and search the cell." Rodriguez nodded. "Will do, boss." Tucker lingered in the visiting room, examining where Carol sat. Something was bothering him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe Harry's reaction, too calm for a man who had just lost his wife and son, or maybe the fear in Carol's eyes. Too much for a simple family argument. He handed the controls over to Rodriguez and walked out, going to find Kowalski and clarify Mrs. Jenkins's condition. It was then that he heard a scream coming from the direction of the women's restroom. Carol stood at the sink in the women's restroom, splashing cold water on her face. Her reflection in the mirror looked alien, pale, eyes widened with fear. She should have felt relieved. She'd finally told Harry the truth, finally shed the weight of guilt and secrets. But instead, all she felt was a growing dread. Harry's gaze, his words, "This is goodbye," continued to echo in her head. She saw something glint in his hand. A weapon? A homemade knife? It didn't matter. What mattered was that he wanted to hurt her. Carol pulled out her phone and opened the last message from Marco. "I'm waiting for your call. Whatever happens, I'm with you. M." Her fingers hovered over the screen. What could she say? That her husband had threatened to kill her? That she feared for her life? As usual, Marco would want to help, want to protect her. But what could he do against Harry, locked up in prison? Suddenly, the bathroom door creaked open. Carol flinched and turned around, but saw no one. Must have been a draft. "Are you all right?" she asked herself, looking in the mirror. "Pull yourself together, Carol. The worst is over. You're free now." She took a deep breath, gathering her strength to get back to the car, to return to her new life. The door of the outermost stall slowly opened behind her. Alex Kowalski met Tucker in the hallway. "Sir, Mrs. Jenkins refused to be escorted to her car." She looked very upset. Tucker frowned. "Where did you leave her?" "She said she wanted to clean herself up before she went to the women's restroom by the exit." Both men flinched as a woman's scream came from around the corner of the corridor, abruptly cut short. They rushed to run, pulling out their batons. When they reached the women's restroom, the door was ajar. Tucker gestured for Kowalski to stand at the door, and he himself peered cautiously inside. "Mrs. Jenkins? Carol? Are you in here?" There was no answer. Tucker pushed the door wider and walked in, Kowalski following. They saw the broken mirror over the sink, the signs of a struggle, an overturned trash can, scattered paper towels, and dark drops on the white tile floor. Blood. "Jesus," Kowalski breathed out. "What happened here?" They moved cautiously through the restroom, checking each stall. In the last one, they saw a body. Carol Jenkins was lying on the floor with her arms spread, her eyes open, her eyes wide with horror. Her throat had been cut open by a deep gash, and her pale blue dress was soaked with blood, turning into a horrible, dark, maroon mass. "Call for backup," Tucker ordered, kneeling beside the body and checking for a pulse, even though he knew it was useless. "And call the sheriff immediately." Alex ran out of the bathroom, snatching the walkie-talkie. Tucker was left alone with a dead woman who only 15 minutes ago had been alive and talking about the future. He looked around, looking for the killer or the murder weapon, but found neither. Questions swirled through his mind. Who could have snuck into the prison's women's restroom and killed Carol? What did this have to do with her quarrel with her husband? Was the object she had seen in Harry's hand really an object? Or maybe Harry had somehow managed to escape from B Block and get to his wife? Alarm sirens howled throughout the building. The prison was going into lockdown mode, all doors automatically closing, all staff mobilizing to search, but Tucker's intuition told him they were already too late. Whoever had killed Carol Jenkins was either safely hidden in the maze of prison corridors or had already left the building. What bothered Tucker most was that the murder had taken place in the sanctity of the prison itself, under the watchful eye of the guards, practically in front of them. If Harry could have done it, how had he managed to bypass all levels of security? And if it wasn't Harry, who was it? And why had they chosen today, right after her painful conversation with her husband? The siren wail drowned out all thoughts, and Tucker's hand involuntarily rested on the holster of his pistol. He'd seen many deaths in his 23 years of service, but this one felt special. It was as if a shadow had cast not only over Carol Jenkins's life, but over the whole of Miltown. Through the open restroom door, he could see the staff already running down the hallway, and he could hear Kowalski's voice over the radio. "Code Red, women's restroom by the north exit. We need a medical team and forensics, and have someone check Jenkins' unit. Now." Sheriff Bobby Simmons walked heavily down the jail corridor. His bulky body, clad in a uniform with a worn star on the chest, moved with a collectedness surprising for his size. His sweaty face, with its uneven stubble, was a mixture of irritation and fatigue. The day was just past noon, and he'd already had to ditch lunch at Maggie's diner because of a call about an incident at the prison. "So a woman was killed in the restroom," he said, looking at Jim Tucker, who was walking beside him. "And it's the wife of one of the inmates." "Carol Jenkins," Tucker nodded. "Harry Jenkins' wife. She was here on a date with her husband. They had an argument, and then she went to the restroom where we later found her body." Simmons shook his head. She and Tucker had known each other since high school, played soccer together, started in law enforcement together. Then their paths had diverged. Tucker had chosen to serve in the jail, and Simmons had become sheriff of Miltown. Of course, in such a small town, they often crossed paths on the job, but it's been a long time since they had the same friendship. "Cutthroat?" Simmons clarified, reviewing the preliminary report the young employee had handed him. "Yes, a deep cut with a sharp instrument," Tucker replied. She struggled with her attacker, and there were traces of skin and blood under her fingernails. They stopped in front of the women's restroom, which was fenced off with yellow tape. 2 forensic officers took photographs and collected samples. The body had already been removed and sent to the morgue. "Where's the husband?" Simmons asked. "In solitary confinement under heavy guard." "You think he had something to do with it?" Was he able to escape and sneak into the women's restroom? Tucker frowned. I checked the cameras. Harry was in his cell block the whole time after the date, going back to his cell, staying there. It's all recorded. Physically, he couldn't have been in two places at once. Simmons scratched his chin thoughtfully. What about accomplices? Maybe he hired someone or talked someone into it. We're checking everyone who's had contact with Jenkins in recent months, Tucker replied. But he's pretty private, keeps to himself. Doesn't seem to have any associates among the inmates. Alex Kowalski fidgeted with the badge on his uniform. Though it wasn't his fault, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd let Carol Jenkins down. Had he insisted on walking her to her car, perhaps things would have turned out differently. Officer Kowalski, Sheriff Simmons addressed him. Can you tell me what you noticed during Mrs. Jenkins's visit? Alex straightened up, ready to spill all his observations. When Mrs. Jenkins came in, she was very nervous. While talking to her husband, it got worse. I overheard part of their conversation. She confessed to infidelity and said she was filing for divorce. Harry Jenkins was furious, threatening her. Did you see a weapon on him? No, sir, but Mrs. Jenkins claimed she saw something shiny in his hand. When things got heated, we cut the visit short. She asked to use the restroom to clean herself up, and I walked her down the hall. And then, I returned to my duties. About 15 minutes later, Chief Tucker and I heard a scream and discovered her body. Simmons made a note in his notebook. You mentioned that Mrs. Jenkins was seeing another man. What do you know about that? Not much, Alex admitted. She dropped her purse once, and a check from an expensive restaurant in the next town fell out. And then I heard her talking to a coworker about a man named Marco. Marco Rivera, Simmons nodded. A technician for the cable company. I've already sent people to bring him in for questioning. The interrogation of Harry Jenkins yielded no new information. The prisoner was shocked to learn of his wife's death and swore his innocence. Security cameras confirmed his words. He was physically unable to leave his cell block. Maybe he had an accomplice, Simmons suggested, as he and Tucker analyzed the situation in his office. Or it was Carol's lover, Tucker replied. Jealousy is a powerful motive. Maybe she's decided to go back to her husband? Simmons shook his head. According to Marco, they planned to leave together after she informed Harry of the divorce plus. He had a solid alibi. He was out installing internet for the Parker family, Mrs. Parker confirmed that he was in their house at the time of the murder. Tucker rubbed his face tiredly. Then who? Who could have broken into the women's restroom, killed Carol, and disappeared without being caught on camera? The answer began to emerge in the evening, when Alex Kowalski, reviewing the duty roster, discovered a strange pattern. Sir, he turned to Tucker, look at this. The guard, Vince Nelson, had switched shifts 3 times to be on duty exactly on the days Mrs. Jenkins visited. He'd been on shift today, too, and he'd taken time off for family reasons after the body was discovered. Tucker frowned. Vince Nelson was a quiet, inconspicuous employee who'd worked at the prison for almost 10 years. Never caused any problems, did his job without question. Where is he now? He said he was going to his mother's in Riverside, Alex answered. But when I tried to contact him to confirm details for the report, his phone was disconnected. The information about Nelson took on a new ominous tone when Donna, Carol's friend from the diner, mentioned in a deposition that Carol had complained about the close attention of one of the security guards. She said he was always looking at her. Donna recounted. She didn't pay attention at first, but lately she became concerned. He was quiet, almost invisible, as she put it. Did she say his name? Simmons asked. No, just said he was a little creepy, always watching but never talking. Simmons sent 2 officers to check out Nelson's house on the outskirts of Miltown. They returned with disturbing news. The house was empty, with signs of a hasty getaway. A neighbor reported seeing Nelson loading things into his car a few hours ago, looking nervous. One more thing, one of the officers added. In the laundry basket, we found a uniform shirt with traces that looked like blood. We sent it to forensics. Put out a bolo, Simmons said. Blue Ford, license plate number you got presumably armed and dangerous. The picture was slowly emerging. Vince Nelson, who had worked in the prison for years, may have developed an obsession with Carol Jenkins. When she went on a date with her husband, and he learned that she was going out of town with her lover, something in him snapped. He could have overheard their conversation, Tucker suggested. We have blind spots for cameras in the hallways. If he knew her visitation schedule. But why the prison? Simmons wondered. Why not wait until she got out and attack somewhere less secure? Because he wanted Harry to be suspected, answered Tucker. The whole town knew that Harry was in jail for murder under the influence. After the argument that witnesses heard, who would doubt that he had done it? The search for Nelson continued through the night. His car was found abandoned in a wooded area 8 miles outside of town. Search teams with dogs have been combing the woods, but so far to no avail. In the solitary confinement cell, Harry Jenkins sat motionless, staring into the void. His wedding ring was clutched in his hand, the only thing linking him to his past life. Carol, the woman he loved most in the world, was now dead. Their son was orphaned, father in prison, mother in the grave. Harry knew that his life was finally ruined. Even if the real killer was found, he had nothing to look forward to for the future. His own temper, his inability to control his anger had cost him everything he loved. Outside the prison walls, Miltown was sinking into. Night lights were on in the houses. People whispered as they discussed the terrible news. The murder in the prison, the guards' escape, the desperate search. A small town where nothing had happened for decades was suddenly at the center of a real drama. And somewhere out there, in the darkness, lurked a man whose obsession had turned to deadly rage. A man who decided that if he couldn't possess the object of his desire, no one else would.